Hey guys, it's Pablo with another Meditation Amsterdam video, and today we're going to be talking about why existing sucks. And I kind of chose that topic a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but as you will see, it is true, no matter how much we try to enjoy ourselves. So let's get started. When it all begins with a kind of a definition of what existence is. Let's start with that. So the term to exist comes from the root ex and sistere, to stand out or separate from. And already there you see hints of where this is going, which is that existing, to exist, means to be standing out, to stand separate from, and therefore not in unity with. And if you look at my past couple of videos, there's a lot to be said about the sense of being one with everything and how that makes you feel safe and happy and at peace. And so existing, or the sense of standing out as a separate self in the world, is implicitly painful. That is something that the yogis found out when they were looking at the fabric of reality and what everything is all about. Now, you could say that that's a little bit of a grim view of things, and you could say like, well, you know, my life doesn't suck. I love existing and I love being around. But if you look a little bit closer, you will realize that you spend all of your time either daydreaming away from the present moment or engaged in activity that distracts you from bare, raw existence. And it is one of the reasons that people hate to meditate. It is scary to sit and do nothing. It's very scary, very unpleasant to just sit and be with yourself. And if you don't believe me, just try it, right? Try to meditate an hour a day. See if you even dare to make a commitment of that kind. Chances are your mind are going to tell you that there's many, many other important things to do. But the truth is, we hate existing. It's a painful business, so we have to constantly engage in activity to keep raw existence at bay, and that's why meditating is hard and very unpleasant, at least in the beginning, unless you come to see that you don't really exist, you don't stand out as a separate entity, and that's part of why we do this. Now, I want to explain why this is the case, and I want to explain how we counteract this and what is the kind of exploration that yogis or siddhas or rishis in ancient times, the kind of exploration that they engaged in to come to this conclusion and how to counteract it. So essentially it goes back to one of our famous type of diagrams in which you have kind of two poles of things. You have your worldly pole, or external reality, the world. You have your heavenly pole, which is, you know, the unmanifested, unknown, you know, all-knowing God or Shiva or whatever, you know, you want to call that. Now, the reason I put the world up and heaven down is because I want to make this look like a tree, and it looks better that way. But, you know, we all know that heaven is above and earth is below. Anyway, so what normally happens is we have, you know, this supposed external world out there. And we have our senses, so we have an eye that sees, and a hand that touches, and an ear that hears, and a mouth that tastes, whatever, and then we have a nose that smells, right? Whatever. So we have those senses, and those are the layer that allows us to come into contact with that outside world. Yeah. And the forms that the outside world takes are infinite, right? It's always in flux and doing things or whatever. Now, based on that contact triggers something to happen inside of us, which is it triggers a big layer of thinking. Those are little T letters that stand for thoughts, right? A lot of thoughts going on all the time about the past, the future, regrets, this and that, whatever, ideas, concepts, things. And these thoughts are attempting to somehow make sense of these things that we're perceiving. Now, a lot of people identify with this layer so that they think they are their thoughts, but really those thoughts are just sort of springing up as a reaction. And they are a reaction not so much to the bare bones perception of the world, but they are a reaction to something that is a little bit deeper than thoughts, and very often outside of our conscious awareness, which is underlying emotions that are out there. So, in other words, what's happening is something happens in the outside world. It is perceived by our senses. It triggers a certain pleasant or unpleasant emotion, but that emotion is kind of hidden from our conscious awareness. It is under our conscious threshold of perception, and we either like it or don't like it, and start to think and generate all these thoughts about how to deal with this external thing, this supposedly external thing. Right? So we start to negotiate with the external world by thinking. And we are either scheming to try to keep something pleasant in place, or we are scheming to try to get away or eliminate something unpleasant. Yeah? So that these emotions are the thing that trigger thoughts. Now, you can see that the relationship between thoughts and emotions seems to be a one-to-many, so that you could encapsulate several thoughts into one emotion, or the other way around. You could say that a single emotion can be responsible for triggering a huge amount of rumination or thinking. Now, so this is the reality for most people. In fact, for most people, reality is sensory perception and thinking in relation to a perceived outside world. Emotions are ooey gooey, things that we don't want to get too close to. They're icky and yucky. And so they are typically either suppressed, repressed, or expressed, and therefore not really dealt with on a conscious level. And so we tend to think a lot. Especially in modern society, we have given a lot of primacy to thought. So we live in our head thinking here, and a lot of it is triggered by these emotions that come from sensory perceptions. Very good. Now, when you deal with things this way, you tend to have an external locus of control, meaning that it is really the world that is determining how you think and feel, and you try to improve how you think and feel by negotiating your way around the world. But what these rishis and these yogis notice is that because the world takes infinite forms, this is an endless exercise. It's never done, and it's always trying to kind of manhandle reality in order to fit what you want. And they said, well, not only let's make our emotions explicit so that our sense of who we are and our sense of experience gets enriched and becomes broader by including emotions into that, but let's, instead of being outward oriented and outward focused and trying to deal with this impermanent, uncontrollable thing out here, let's go in the opposite direction and go inward instead and see what do we find. And what they found was very interesting, which is that emotions are driven by desires and fears. Yeah, so desire, fear, desire, fear, desire, fear. Very good. So they said, oh, well, that's very interesting, right? So it looks like there's an underlying desire or an underlying fear that keeps this emotion, this potential emotion here. And when a certain event in the outside world takes place, it touches on that fear, it triggers the emotion, and suddenly thought goes to work to try to somehow deal with it. So instead of trying to deal with things externally and with thoughts, it looks like we need to get to these desires and fears and see what is the root of that, right? So that we keep going further down. And what they realized that is that ultimately there is a base fear/desire that is at the root of all of these, right? And that is the fear/desire of existing. And that fear/desire at the very root of the entire thing is caused, yet again, if we go deeper, by one thing alone. One incorrect misperception, which stands at the root of the entire tree of existence. Yeah, this is what in yoga is known as the cycle of samsara, the wheel of birth and death, in which you live in this periphery of sense perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and you are a separate entity in a world that you cannot possibly control. There was a poem by someone which went along the lines of I in a stranger at the mercy of a world that I didn't create, something along those lines. So that's how this feels like, the wheel of samsara, the cycle of reincarnation, birth and death. And at the very root of this entire thing sits the I thought, the I am. Yeah. Now, it's a little bit ironic because your I amness, or the I, is hailed as like, you know, the one thing that you want to get at, right? Like the self. However, this needs to be understood very carefully. See, the I am, or the I thought, is your very sense of individuality. Whatever it is, whatever ghost in the machine you feel yourself to be, which is interacting with your body and with the world, is your I amness. So there's several names for that. One of them that I really like actually is a yogic name, Aham Vritti. I really like this one actually because I'll explain why. So what is a vritti? A vritti is a fluctuation of the mind. It's a kind of boing, the mind sort of being active, right? And thinking, emotions, fears, desires are all vrittis. They are all the mind doing its thing, the mind being active. Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra said that yoga was chitta vritti nirodha, the elimination of the vrittis of the mind, the cessation of these fluctuations, so that if you manage to get this entire thing to cease through perfect meditation and reaching very deep levels of absorption or samadhi, that was yoga. However, that approach seems to have a very deep flaw in it, which is that you can get this entire thing to cease. You can get very good at doing that. You can get very good at entering meditations or absorption states in which mind ceases, breath ceases. All it takes is practice. There's nothing strange about it. But the moment you come out of meditation, immediately your senses come back to life, your emotions, fears, everything comes back up to life. Because no matter how good you get at meditating, unless you have eliminated the root vritti, the root thought that says I am, everything, this is like the seed thought for the entire tree of existence or the entire tree of suffering and samsara to spring back up to life. So there were jhana yogis or yogis that are dedicated to true knowing. And what they said was, no, instead of trying to eliminate thought or make it subside, instead of trying to have good emotions or no emotions and trying to make yourself like this statue that doesn't feel, instead of trying to be a stoic that, you know, cuts through fear and plows through whatever, or instead of being what you could call a renunciate, you know, those guys who abstain, right, from everything and trying to eliminate desire, you know, that's trying to fight all these different battles on so many fronts. Whereas what you really need to do is observe your I amness relentlessly. Observe the Aham Vritti, the seed thought I am, the thought that generates this entire thing. Now, it is important to realize that it is your very I amness, your very sense of separate individuality that triggers the root desire and fear to spring. And from there, you're gone, right? From there, everything is good and bad and helpful or unhelpful, you know, pleasant, unpleasant. And you are now in negotiation with the world. But it stems from the fact that you consider yourself to be an individual entity, and the sense of individuality creates pain by definition, by default. That's why I was saying that existing sucks, because the moment you exist, the moment you are a separate individual entity, or you perceive yourself to be such, you're in pain already. You may not know it, but you are, or you are at least potentially in pain. Even if something good happens in the world, there is an underlying fear that that goodness is going to go away, and you know that it will go away because you know that the world is impermanent, right? So you're constantly trying to keep up with that and negotiate with it. So, so what these guys said is, look, there's all these fluctuations of thought, emotion, fear, desire, sense perceptions, whatever. But the one fluctuation that matters, the one that you should look at, is the Aham Vritti, the fluctuation that says I am. Because before you can think about anything, you need to think I am thinking this thought. Before you can feel an emotion, you need to say I am. The problem with the Aham Vritti, the sense of individuality, is that it is extremely subtle. It's implicitly implicit, right? It's all the way back there in the back. It is your very sense of existence, your very sense of self. Normal thoughts, pleasant and unpleasant, are they're hard to catch when you're involved in them, but you can learn to observe them. You can learn to observe emotions. You can learn to observe desires. You can learn to observe fears. Eventually, what you want to learn how to observe is your very sense of self, your very sense of individuality. The best way I can describe it is when you are lost in thought and then you come back to your sense of self. And that's what you want to observe. So you turn attention onto itself and you try to find out what it is that you are in there. Try to find, when you say I, what is it that you mean? Is it the body? Is it the thoughts? What is it that you mean by I? What you're going to find is that it doesn't exist. It's a construct. It's an idea. But it's a very persistent idea. And it's very subtle. Like I said, it's implicit. Talking to a friend of mine, trying to explain this, he said to me, so you're saying that you're trying to see yourself from a helicopter view. And I said, no, you're trying to find out who's sitting in the helicopter. Who's doing the viewing? To whom are thoughts occurring? To whom are emotions occurring? Who is it the one that fears? Who is it the one that says I? What do I mean by that? And to go back to that over and over and over and over again, And the thing with this I amness is because it's unreal, because it doesn't really exist, it can't stand up to scrutiny. But because it is so subtle and implicit, it takes a lot of work and a lot of sustained attention on that I amness to begin eroding it. There is no way to erode the ego and suffering on the level of thinking, emotions, fears, or desires, right? You can think, oh, I'm going to be less egoic. But the question is, who is thinking that? It is your sense of separate self that is thinking that. So it's a useless exercise. It's self-defeating. You can try to have nicer emotions or be a better person or whatever. It doesn't work. It does work to a limited degree for one reason, which is this trip inwards is beset by thoughts and emotions that keep pulling you out. So you are better off trying to have very nice, clean thoughts, very nice, clean emotions, not because they are an end product in and of themselves, but because they ease and stabilize your journey inward so that you can get to your root fears and desires and then pass them into your root or core sense of individuality, your Aham Vritti, the sense I am, which is false, right? So it is worshipped as the ultimate thing because it is the gateway to the undefined, to the undifferentiated awareness. So you look for it, you worship it, you meditate on it, you become its very best friend, your I amness, only because you are trying to transcend it and go into an undifferentiated sense of self. And once you reside here, so once your sense of identity is eliminated, the undifferentiated is a very, sort of very neutral state, because you are no longer a separate entity, and therefore your base fears and desires have nobody to defend. So they just kind of crumble on its own. That's what makes the entire edifice of samsaric existence or existence to essentially vanish, right? To those who have made the journey from an externally oriented sense of self to the I amness, I would claim that I am sitting on this one right now, right? So I'm less identified with this. I'm sitting here. There are those who sit here so much that becomes eroded in itself, and they come here and they claim that it is a blissful existence that fulfills the purpose of a human life. I can't vouch for it, but I can vouch for the fact that every step in this direction has been very pleasant, very constructive, and very interesting. So, well, it seems to be that there is a phase of expansion when we are born, we go out there, we do things in the world, and that comes to a natural limit on what it can deliver, because it all crumbles. And then there is a pull to go inward at some point and to go all the way to the very root of what's real. I hope that makes some sense, and I'll be back with more videos. Cheerio.